The screenshot notification appeared on my phone at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and with it, everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the man I'd been planning to marry came crashing down around me. It was Sophia, my best friend, sending me an urgent message with a single image attached. A reverse image search result that would shatter 2 years of carefully constructed lies and reveal that Jake Williams, the love of my life, didn't exist. The photo showed a male model from a stock photography website, the same face I'd been staring at lovingly for 730 days, the same smile I'd fallen asleep thinking about every night, the same eyes that had promised me forever through video calls that now made perfect, horrible sense. Below the image were the words that would echo in my mind for months. Original source Getty Images model portfolio, licensed for commercial use. My hands trembled as I stared at my phone screen in my darkened Austin apartment, the city lights casting shadows across walls covered with printed photos of us, or rather, photos of me and a complete stranger, whose real name I was about to discover in the most devastating way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to the beginning. To when I was Emma Rodriguez, a 26-year-old graphic designer living in downtown Austin, completely convinced I'd found my soulmate through a dating app called TrueConnect. I was successful, independent, and had just landed my dream client designing the entire visual identity for a tech startup that was about to go public. Life was good, and meeting Jake had made it perfect. Jake Williams had slid into my TrueConnect messages on a rainy Thursday evening in March, 2 years and 3 months before that life-changing screenshot would arrive. His profile was immaculate, photos of a stunningly handsome man with dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could melt glaciers. His bio read like something out of a romance novel, adventure photographer traveling the world, but looking for someone special to share the sunsets with. Love hiking, cooking Italian food, and deep conversations under starry skies. I should have known it was too good to be true. But at 24, fresh out of a long relationship that had ended badly, and working 16-hour days building my freelance design career, I was vulnerable to exactly the kind of romantic fantasy Jake was selling. Our first conversation lasted until he told me he was currently on assignment in Iceland, photographing the northern lights for National Geographic, a detail that explained why we couldn't meet immediately, but added an exotic allure to his persona. He sent me breathtaking photos of landscapes that I later discovered were stolen from various professional photographers' portfolios, each one accompanied by stories of adventure and wanderlust that painted him as this incredibly worldly, artistic soul. What struck me most about Jake was how interested he seemed in my life, my dreams, my work. He asked detailed questions about my design projects, remembered small details from conversations we'd had days earlier, and seemed genuinely invested in my success. When I told him about landing the tech startup client, he celebrated with me over video chat, his excitement seemingly as genuine as my own. The video calls were what convinced me he was real. We talked for hours every few days, his face filling my laptop screen as he told me stories about his travels, asked about my day, and gradually made me fall completely in love with him. He was articulate, funny, and seemed to understand me in ways no one else ever had. The calls always came at odd hours, which he explained as being due to time zone differences and his unpredictable work schedule. Looking back now, I realized the calls were perfectly orchestrated. They were always brief enough to prevent detailed scrutiny, always at times when lighting conditions could justify any technical glitches, and always scheduled in advance, giving him time to prepare. But at the time, seeing his face move, hearing his voice, watching his expressions as we talked, it never occurred to me that I might be watching an elaborate performance. Jake's photography career provided the perfect explanation for his constant travel and unpredictable schedule. He was always just finishing an assignment in some remote location, about to head somewhere with limited internet access, or dealing with equipment problems that made communication difficult. For 2 years, there was always a perfectly reasonable explanation for why we couldn't meet in person, even though he claimed to be based in Dallas, just 3 hours from Austin. The closest we came to meeting was a planned weekend in San Antonio that fell through at the last minute, when Jake claimed he'd been offered an emergency assignment, photographing a wildlife preserve in Costa Rica, an opportunity too good to pass up for his career. I was disappointed but understanding, proud of his dedication to his art, and excited about the stories he'd bring back. He sent me daily updates from Costa Rica, photos of exotic birds and lush rainforests, stories about sleeping in tents, and eating fresh fruit picked directly from trees. The photos were stunning, professionally composed, and completely convincing. I shared them on my own social media, bragging to friends about my boyfriend's incredible adventure. Every excuse was reasonable, every explanation logical, every disappointment balanced with promises of future meetings and romantic gestures that kept me invested. Jake sent flowers to my apartment for my birthday, had gourmet chocolates delivered during stressful work weeks, and even arranged for a mariachi band to serenade me outside my office building on our one-year anniversary. The gestures were grand, romantic, and perfectly designed to make me feel special while maintaining the illusion of a relationship with someone who cared deeply about me. What I didn't realize was that every romantic gesture was paid for through careful research and online ordering, requiring no physical presence in Austin. The flowers came from a local delivery service, with notes written in Jake's distinctive style. The chocolates were ordered from a boutique website with personalized messages. Even the mariachi band was hired through an entertainment booking platform, with specific instructions about what songs to play and what message to deliver. My friends and family had mixed reactions to Jake. My best friend Sophia was initially skeptical about a long-distance relationship with someone I'd never met in person, but even she was won over by the constant communication, the thoughtful gestures, and the obvious happiness the relationship brought me. My older brother David, who worked in cybersecurity, had expressed some concerns about online relationships early on, but Jake's video calls and social media presence seemed to alleviate his worry. Jake maintained active profiles on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, all filled with professional quality travel photography and carefully curated personal posts. His Instagram showed a life of adventure, mountain climbing in Colorado, surfing in California, photographing wildlife in Alaska. His LinkedIn profile detailed an impressive career trajectory from freelance photographer to sought-after nature documentarian. His Facebook was more personal, showing casual moments from his travels, photos of meals he'd cooked, and romantic posts about missing me while he was away. The social media presence was sophisticated and internally consistent. Photos were posted in real time with appropriate geolocation tags, captions referenced current events and weather conditions, and the content spanned years, creating a believable history. Friends and family members commented on his posts, though I later realized these were either fake accounts or other victims who'd been incorporated into his elaborate fiction. As our relationship progressed, Jake became increasingly integrated into my daily life, despite his physical absence. We texted throughout the day, shared photos of our meals, and talked every evening when his schedule permitted. He knew my work deadlines, remembered my friends' names, and celebrated my professional achievements with genuine enthusiasm. When I was stressed about a difficult client, he offered thoughtful advice about design challenges. When I was excited about a new project, he asked detailed questions that showed he was really listening. The emotional intimacy we shared felt completely real. Jake knew my insecurities about my career, my complicated relationship with my parents, and my dreams of eventually opening my own design studio. He shared what seemed like equally personal details about his own life stories about growing up with a single mother who encouraged his artistic pursuits, fears about whether his adventurous lifestyle would ever allow for a stable relationship, and dreams of settling down somewhere beautiful with someone who understood his creative passion. We talked about our future together constantly. Jake painted vivid pictures of the life we'd build, a house in the mountains, where he could edit his photographs, and I could run my design studio. Traveling together to exotic locations, where I'd experience the adventures he'd been having alone, maybe even collaborating professionally on travel documentaries that would combine his photography with my design skills. These conversations about our future felt so real, so detailed, so emotionally resonant, that I began making practical decisions based on them. I started learning Spanish, because Jake wanted to spend extended time photographing in South America. I researched mountain towns in Colorado where we might eventually live. I even turned down a lucrative long-term contract that would have required me to relocate to California, explaining to the client that I needed to stay flexible for upcoming travel opportunities with my boyfriend. My relationship with Jake became the central organizing principle of my life. I planned my schedule around our video calls, saved money for the international travel we'd discussed, and made major life decisions based on a future I believed we were building together. My other relationships suffered as I became increasingly focused on this all-consuming romance with someone who existed only in my imagination. Looking back, I can see how perfectly Jake's persona was designed to appeal to someone exactly like me. He was creative like I was, but in a field adjacent to mine that made collaboration seem natural. He was adventurous in ways that complemented my own desire for travel and new experiences. He was successful enough to be impressive, but not so wealthy that financial motives seemed obvious. He was emotionally available and communicative in ways that addressed the shortcomings I'd experienced in previous relationships. But what really made Jake's deception so effective was how gradually it developed. He didn't immediately profess love or push for a quick commitment. Instead, he built trust slowly, proving his reliability through consistent communication, demonstrating his care through thoughtful gestures, and creating emotional intimacy through vulnerable conversations that felt genuine and spontaneous. The relationship followed a natural progression from casual chatting to deep friendship to romantic love to serious commitment. Each stage felt organic, driven by mutual attraction and compatibility rather than manipulation. By the time I was completely in love with Jake Williams, the foundation of lies supporting his existence was invisible beneath layers of shared experiences, emotional connection, and future plans that felt absolutely real. For 2 years I lived inside this carefully constructed fantasy, completely convinced that I'd found the love of my life in a brilliant photographer who understood me better than anyone ever had. I was planning to move to Dallas to be closer to his home base when his travel schedule finally lightened. We'd discussed marriage, children, and growing old together with the kind of detail that only comes from genuine emotional investment. The morning that Sophia's screenshot arrived, I'd fallen asleep with my phone clutched in my hand, rereading sweet text messages Jake had sent from his latest assignment in Montana. The last thing I'd done before closing my eyes was look at his latest Instagram post, a stunning sunset over Glacier National Park, with a caption about how beautiful moments made him miss me even more. I had no idea that within hours, my entire reality would collapse, and I'd discover that Jake Williams was a fiction created by someone whose real name, real face, and real intentions were about to shock me in ways I never could have imagined. The adventure photographer who'd stolen my heart didn't exist, but the man. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Who'd created him was very real, and he was about to become the most important person in my life for entirely different reasons. Sophia's call came at 6:30 a.m., her voice tight with concern and barely controlled anger. I was still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling of my Austin apartment, my mind struggling to process what the reverse image search had revealed about Jake's photos. The screenshot she'd sent continued to glow on my phone screen like evidence of my own stupidity, the Getty Images watermark mocking every moment of happiness I'd felt over the past 2 years. "Emma, are you okay?" Sophia's voice cut through my mental fog. "I've been awake all night running searches on every photo he's ever sent you. Honey, I need you to sit down." I was already sitting, but my legs felt like they might give out anyway. "What did you find?" The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like hours before Sophia spoke again. "Emma, every single photo of Jake Williams has been stolen from different sources. The hiking pictures are from a travel blogger in Oregon. The cooking photos are from a food photography portfolio. Even the candid shots he claimed were taken by friends are from various social media accounts of people who have no idea their images are being used." My stomach lurched as the full scope of the deception began to crystallize. This wasn't just someone using a few fake photos to look more attractive online. This was a comprehensive identity theft involving dozens of images carefully curated to create a completely fictional person. The Jake Williams I'd fallen in love with had never existed anywhere, except in my imagination and the elaborate lies of whoever had been manipulating me for 2 years. "There's more," Sophia continued, her voice gentle but determined. "I found the same photos being used on dating profiles across multiple platforms, always with different names and backgrounds. Jake Williams, the adventure photographer, also appears to be Marcus Thompson, the travel writer, and David Chen, the freelance journalist. Whoever this person really is, he's running multiple fake identities simultaneously." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only was Jake not who he claimed to be, but I wasn't even his only victim. I was part of some elaborate scheme involving multiple women, all of us falling in love with different versions of the same stolen fate. The romantic conversations that had felt so personal and intimate were probably being replicated with other women, each of us believing we were special, each of us planning futures with a man who didn't exist. I stumbled to my kitchen and made coffee with shaking hands, needing something concrete and routine to anchor myself as my reality dissolved. Sophia stayed on the phone with me, her presence a lifeline as I processed the magnitude of what I'd discovered. She'd been my best friend since college, and I could hear the barely contained fury in her voice as she realized how thoroughly I'd been deceived. "I should have pushed harder when you two kept canceling meetings," Sophia said, her voice thick with guilt. "I should have insisted on video calling him myself or meeting him when he was supposedly in Texas. I should have protected you from this." But I knew the fault wasn't Sophia. The person behind Jake's identity had been incredibly sophisticated, anticipating exactly the kind of skepticism that might arise from friends and family. The video calls, the social media presence, the romantic gestures delivered to my apartment, everything had been designed to create credibility and deflect suspicion. Even someone as naturally protective as Sophia had been convinced by the elaborate performance. As the morning progressed, I found myself obsessively reviewing every interaction I'd had with Jake, searching for clues I'd missed, signs I should have recognized, moments when the carefully constructed facade might have slipped. But the deception had been masterful in its attention to detail. Whoever was behind it understood not just how to create a fake identity, but how to maintain it convincingly over an extended period while building genuine emotional intimacy with his victim. The video calls that had seemed like proof of Jake's authenticity now felt like evidence of how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. The person on those calls had been real, but everything about his appearance had been altered through sophisticated filters and digital manipulation that I'd been too trusting to recognize. The lighting conditions that I'd attributed to his exotic locations had actually been carefully controlled to obscure details that might have revealed the deception. Every romantic gesture that had made me feel cherished now seemed like calculated manipulation designed to keep me emotionally invested while preventing me from asking too many questions. The flowers, the chocolates, the mariachi band, all of it had been orchestrated by someone who understood exactly how to maintain a long-distance relationship without ever risking in-person contact that would expose his lie. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jake, sent from what was supposed to be his assignment in Montana. "Good morning, beautiful. Missing you extra today. Can't wait to share these mountain sunrise photos with you tonight. Love you endless." The message that would have filled me with warmth just hours earlier now felt like poison, each word a reminder of how completely I'd been fooled. I screenshot the message and sent it to Sophia, who responded immediately with analysis that chilled me to the bone. "Emma, look at the timestamp. This message was sent at 5:47 a.m. Mountain Time, which means whoever sent it was awake and actively messaging you while I was sending you the reverse image search results. He has no idea you've discovered the truth." The realization that my catfish was continuing his performance even as I uncovered his deception added another layer of horror to the situation. He was still playing Jake Williams, still sending loving messages, still maintaining the romantic facade that had consumed 2 years of my life. The casualness of his continued lies suggested this was routine for him, just another day of managing multiple fake relationships with women who had no idea they were being systematically deceived. I spent the rest of the morning conducting my own reverse image searches, diving deeper into the digital breadcrumbs that would reveal the scope of what I was dealing with. Sophia had been thorough, but I needed to see the evidence myself to understand exactly how extensive the deception had been. What I discovered was a masterclass in identity fraud that spanned multiple platforms, dozens of stolen images, and carefully crafted backstories that intersected just enough to seem consistent. The Jake Williams Instagram account that had convinced me of his authenticity was revealed to be a sophisticated collage of stolen content. The landscape photography that I'd admired came from professional nature photographers whose work had been reposted without credit. The personal moments that had felt intimate were actually stock photos purchased from various photography websites. Even the food photos that Jake had claimed to take himself were lifted from cooking blogs and restaurant social media accounts. Most disturbing was discovering that some of the candid photos Jake had sent me were actually stolen from other women's social media accounts. Pictures that he'd claimed were taken by friends during casual gatherings were actually screenshots from Instagram stories posted by women who had no idea their images were being used to catfish strangers. These women had become unwitting accomplices in my deception, their genuine moments of happiness repurposed to create false intimacy with someone they'd never met. The social media rabbit hole led me to discover something even more alarming. Using the same reverse image search technique Sophia had taught me, I found Jake's face being used across multiple dating platforms with completely different backstories. On one site, he was a travel writer named Marcus Thompson based in Denver. On another, he was David Chen, a freelance journalist living in Seattle. Each identity had its own carefully crafted personality, professional background, and relationship history. What struck me most was how each fake identity was tailored to appeal to different types of women. Jake Williams, the adventure photographer, was designed to attract creative types like me, who valued artistic passion and wanderlust. Marcus Thompson, the travel writer, appealed to intellectual women who prioritized communication and cultural sophistication. David Chen, the journalist, was crafted for career-focused women who wanted partners with similar professional ambitions. The psychological sophistication required to maintain multiple fake identities simultaneously was staggering. This wasn't some amateur catfish using a few stolen photos to get attention online. This was a professional-level operation that required extensive planning, careful research, and the ability to compartmentalize multiple elaborate deceptions without allowing them to interfere with each other. I found myself wondering how many women were currently experiencing what I was going through, how many others were waking up to loving text messages from Jake or Marcus or David, completely unaware that their relationships were built on love. How many were making life decisions based on futures with men who didn't exist? How many were turning down real opportunities for fake relationships with a master manipulator? The thought of other victims experiencing the same devastation I felt sparked something unexpected. Anger, not just sadness or betrayal, but genuine fury at whoever was behind this elaborate scheme. He wasn't just lying to me. He was systematically destroying the ability of multiple women to trust, to love, to believe in the possibility of genuine connection. He was stealing more than just our time and emotional energy. He was stealing our faith in love itself. By midday, I'd compiled a comprehensive file of evidence documenting the scope of Jake's deception. Screenshots of reverse image searches, archived versions of his social media posts, and comparisons showing how the same photos were being used across multiple fake identities. The evidence painted a picture of someone who'd been operating this scheme for years, possibly targeting dozens of women with the same methodical precision he'd used on me. Sophia arrived at my apartment around noon, bringing lunch and a bottle of wine that we both agreed I'd need before the day was over. She'd spent the morning conducting her own investigation, using her professional skills in social media management to dig deeper into the technical aspects of Jake's deception. What she'd discovered was even more disturbing than what I'd found on my own. "Emma, this goes way beyond just stolen photos," Sophia said, spreading printouts across my coffee table like evidence in a crime scene. "Whoever is behind this has been sophisticated enough to create fake email addresses, phone numbers, and even business websites to support his various identities. The National Geographic assignment he claimed to be on. I found a fake press release on a website that was created specifically to support that lie. The revelation that my catfish had created entire fake websites to support his deceptions was overwhelming. This wasn't just someone telling lies in text messages. This was someone willing to invest significant time and money into creating elaborate fictional reality. The level of commitment required suggested this was either his full-time occupation or a psychological compulsion that went far beyond typical online deception. Sophia showed me archived versions of websites that had been created to support Jake's various claimed assignments. The Costa Rica wildlife preserve he'd supposedly photographed had a fake website complete with press releases mentioning his work. The Montana landscape assignment he was currently claiming to be on was supported by a fictional photography magazine website that existed solely to provide credibility for his lies. "Look at this," Sophia said, pointing to a fake LinkedIn profile for a photography editor who'd supposedly hired Jake for multiple assignments. This profile was created just to give his stories credibility. It has fake connections to real photography professionals, fake recommendations from other fictional people, and even fake portfolio samples. Someone spent weeks creating this single supporting character for his elaborate lie. The realization that my relationship existed within a web of fictional supporting characters was perhaps the most surreal aspect of the entire discovery. Not only was Jake Williams fake, but so were many of the people he'd mentioned throughout our relationship. The editor who'd given him prestigious assignments, the fellow photographers he'd supposedly met on location, the friends who'd allegedly taken some of his candid photos, all of them were fictional characters created to support his central deception. As afternoon turned to evening, I found myself cycling through emotions faster than I could process them: anger at being so thoroughly deceived, sadness for the loss of what I'd believed was the love of my life, embarrassment at how naive I'd been, fear about what this meant for my ability to trust anyone in the future, and underneath it all, a growing determination to understand who had done this to me and why. The text messages from Jake continued throughout the day, each one a reminder of how the performance was continuing even as I dismantled it piece by piece. He sent photos from his supposed Montana assignment, shared stories about challenging hiking conditions, and expressed romantic sentiments about missing me that now felt like mockery. The disconnect between his continued lies and my growing knowledge of the truth created a surreal sense of living in two realities simultaneously. That evening, Sophia and I discussed what my next steps should be. She advocated for immediately confronting Jake with what I'd discovered, exposing his lies and demanding answers about his real identity, but something in me hesitated. After 2 years of believing in this relationship completely, I needed more than just evidence of deception. I needed to understand who was really behind it and what his motivations had been. "What if I'm not the only current victim?" I asked Sophia as we sat on my couch surrounded by printouts and screenshots. "What if there are other women right now planning their lives around relationships with Marcus or David? Don't they deserve to know the truth too?" The question opened up possibilities I hadn't considered early. If I simply confronted Jake and ended our relationship, he might disappear and start over with new identities, leaving his other current victims unaware of what they were dealing with. But if I could find a way to identify those other women, maybe we could work together to expose him completely and ensure he couldn't continue targeting new victims. Sophia looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Emma, what you're talking about sounds like it could be dangerous. We don't know anything about who this person really is or what he might be capable of if he realizes you're investigating him, but the possibility of preventing other women from experiencing what I was going through felt more important than my own safety. I'd been living a lie for 2 years, making major life decisions based on a fictional future with a man who didn't exist. If I could save even one other woman from that devastating discovery, the risk would be worth it." As night fell over Austin, I made a decision that would change not just my own path forward, but potentially the lives of every woman who'd been targeted by whoever was behind Jake Williams. Instead of simply ending my fake relationship, I was going to uncover the real identity of my catfish and document everything he'd done. I was going to transform from victim to investigator, and I was going to make sure that whoever had stolen 2 years of my life faced consequences for his actions. The woman who went to bed that Tuesday night was fundamentally different from the one who'd woken up that morning. I was no longer Emma Rodriguez, the trusting graphic designer who'd fallen in love with an adventure photographer named Jake Williams. I was Emma Rodriguez, the determined investigator who was about to embark on the most important project of her life, bringing down the man who'd convinced me to love a ghost. The hardest part about discovering Jake's deception wasn't the anger or the heartbreak, it was having to pretend nothing had changed while I conducted my investigation. Wednesday morning arrived with another sweet text from my fake boyfriend, complete with a photo of what he claimed was his sunrise view from Glacier National Park. The image was stunning, professionally composed, and according to my reverse search, stolen from a nature photographer's portfolio that had been published 3 months earlier. Missing your beautiful smile this morning, his message read. Only 2 more days on this assignment, then I'll have better signal to call you. Can't wait to hear your voice and tell you about all the incredible wildlife I've been photographing. Love you more than these Montana mountains are tall. I stared at the message for a full 10 minutes, my coffee growing cold as I wrestled with the cognitive dissonance of reading romantic words from someone who'd been systematically deceiving me for 2 years. The Jake Williams, who'd sent this message, had no idea that I'd discovered his elaborate fiction. In his mind, I was still the devoted girlfriend planning our future together, still the trusting woman who believed every word of his carefully crafted lie. Responding to his message felt like stepping into a play where I had to perform a role I no longer believed in. But if I was going to investigate his true identity and potentially help other victims, I needed to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. I needed to become an actress in the very performance that had been destroying my life. Missing you too, I typed back, each word feeling like sandpaper in my throat. Your photos are incredible as always. I've been working on that tech startup logo we discussed. The client loves the mountain theme you inspired. Can't wait to show you when you get back. Love you endlessly. Sending that message was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. Every instinct screamed at me to confront him, to demand answers, to unleash the fury that had been building since Sophia's screenshot had shattered my reality. But I forced myself to think strategically. Jake had been planning and executing this deception for years. If I was going to outsmart him, I needed to be just as methodical and patient as he'd been. Sophia arrived at my apartment an hour later with a plan that was both brilliant and terrifying. She'd spent the night researching digital investigation techniques, consulting with contacts in her social media marketing network, who specialized in tracking fake accounts and online fraud. What she'd learned had convinced her that we were dealing with someone far more sophisticated than either of us had initially realized. Emma, we need to think about this like a professional investigation, Sophia said, setting up her laptop on my dining room table and pulling out a notebook filled with detailed notes. Whoever is behind Jake's identity isn't just some lonely guy using fake photos to get attention. This is someone running what's essentially a business, probably targeting multiple women simultaneously and potentially for financial gain. The possibility that there might be financial motivations behind Jake's deception hadn't occurred to me, but Sophia's research had uncovered patterns that suggested money might be involved. She'd found evidence that some of the other fake identities using Jake's photos had requested loans or investment opportunities from their victims. While Jake had never directly asked me for money, Sophia pointed out that he'd influenced several of my financial decisions over the past 2 years. Think about it, Sophia continued, spreading out bank statements and credit card bills I'd provided. You turned down that California contract partly because Jake convinced you that you'd be traveling together soon. You've been saving money for international trips you planned to take with him. You even bought expensive photography equipment because he convinced you to try landscape photography as a hobby you could share. Looking at the financial impact laid out in black and white was sobering. While Jake had never directly stolen money from me, his influence had cost me thousands of dollars in lost opportunities and expenses related to our fake relationship. The photography equipment alone had cost me $3,000, money I'd spent to pursue a hobby that would supposedly bring us closer together when he was between assignments. More troubling was the realization that Jake knew extensive details about my financial situation. Over 2 years of intimate conversations, I'd shared information about my business income, my savings goals, and my family's financial background. He knew I came from a middle-class family, but had built a successful design business. He knew I owned my apartment and had minimal debt. He knew exactly how much financial vulnerability I might have if someone wanted to exploit it. Sophia's investigation had also revealed technical details about Jake's operation that suggested a level of sophistication that went far beyond casual catfish. The fake websites supporting his various identities weren't just hastily constructed lies, they were professionally designed, optimized for search engines, and maintained with regular updates that would fool even careful scrutiny. "Look at this," Sophia said, showing me archived versions of the fake National Geographic assignment website. "This site has been updated consistently for 8 months, with new content added regularly to maintain the illusion. Someone has been investing serious time and probably money into making these lies convincing. This isn't a hobby for whoever is doing this. It's a full-time operation." The realization that I'd been targeted by what amounted to a professional con artist was both terrifying and oddly validating. My devastation wasn't the result of being unusually gullible or naive. I'd been deceived by someone who'd perfected the art of manipulation over years of practice. The Jake Williams identity had been crafted specifically to appeal to women like me, tested and refined through previous victims, until it became virtually undetectable. Throughout Wednesday, I maintained my normal routine while conducting parallel investigations into Jake's true identity. I worked on client projects, responded to business emails, and kept up appearances of being the successful graphic designer whose life was perfectly on track. But underneath the professional facade, I was systematically dismantling everything I'd believed about my relationship. The video calls that had seemed like proof of Jake's authenticity became the focus of my investigation. Sophia had connected me with a tech-savvy friend who specialized in digital forensics, and together we analyzed archived recordings of conversations I'd saved on my laptop. What we discovered was disturbing evidence of sophisticated digital manipulation that had allowed someone to completely alter their appearance in real-time video. "See these artifacts around the facial feature," Sophia's friend Marcus pointed out, highlighting subtle inconsistencies in the video quality that I'd attributed to poor internet connections. "These are characteristic of real-time deepfake technology. Someone has been using advanced software to completely change their appearance during your video calls." The technology required to pull off such deception was expensive and complex, further evidence that this wasn't some amateur operation. Whoever was behind Jake's identity had invested significant resources into creating a system that could maintain the illusion of face-to-face contact, while completely concealing their true appearance. I'd been having intimate video conversations with a computer-generated face for 2 years. My phone buzzed with another message from Jake, this one including a selfie supposedly taken during his Montana assignment. The photo showed his familiar handsome face against a backdrop of mountain peaks, his expression warm and loving as always. Knowing what I now knew about digital manipulation, the image looked obviously fake. The lighting didn't quite match between his face and the background, and there were subtle artifacts around the edges of his features that screamed digital composition. "Getting some amazing shots today," his message read. "This assignment is going to be incredible for my portfolio. The magazine editor is already talking about featuring my work on the cover. Can't wait to celebrate with you when I get home. Maybe we can finally plan that trip to Colorado we've been talking about." The reference to our Colorado plans stung more than I'd expected. We'd spent hours discussing the mountain town where we might eventually live together, researching real estate prices and planning the photography studio Jake would build for his work. I'd even started learning about high-altitude gardening because Jake had convinced me we'd want to grow our own vegetables at elevation. Every detail of our imagined future had been carefully cultivated through his life. Responding to his messages while knowing the truth required a level of emotional compartmentalization I didn't know I possessed. I had to channel the trusting girlfriend I'd been just days earlier, responding with the same enthusiasm and love I'd genuinely felt before discovering his deception. It was like method acting for the most important performance of my life. "Your work always amazes me," I replied, forcing warmth into words that felt like ashes. "I've been looking at those Colorado property listings again, found a few places with perfect spaces for photography studio. Can't wait to start planning our adventure together. Love you to the moon and back." Each exchange felt like a small death, the killing of the innocent trust that had defined our relationship. but maintaining the performance was crucial if I was going to gather enough evidence to expose him completely. I needed him to believe that I remained the devoted girlfriend while I systematically documented every aspect of his deception. Sophia and I spent Wednesday evening creating what we called our evidence database, a comprehensive collection of screenshots, reverse image searches, archived social media posts, and technical analyses that documented the full scope of Jake's elaborate fiction. We organized everything chronologically, creating a timeline that showed how the deception had evolved and expanded over 2 years. What emerged from our analysis was a portrait of someone with an almost pathological attention to detail. Jake's lies weren't random or inconsistent. They formed a coherent narrative that had been carefully planned and executed. His supposed photography assignments always had supporting documentation. His travel stories included specific details about locations, weather conditions, and local customs that would have required extensive research to fabricate convincingly. "Look at this pattern," Sophia said, pointing to a timeline of Jake's supposed assignment. "His trips always coincide with periods when you might have expected more contact or in-person meetings. Christmas, your birthday, Valentine's Day. He always had perfectly timed assignments that kept him away during times when a real boyfriend would be expected to be present." The strategic timing of his absences revealed a level of psychological manipulation that was chilling in its sophistication. Jake hadn't just been lying about his identity, he'd been carefully managing my expectations and emotions to prevent me from questioning why we never met in person. Every disappointment had been cushioned with romantic gestures. Every cancelled plan had been balanced with promises of future adventures. My brother David called that evening, his cybersecurity expertise offering a new perspective on what we were dealing with. I'd finally told him about discovering Jake's deception, and his professional response was both reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because he confirmed that the level of sophistication involved meant I shouldn't feel foolish for being deceived. Alarming because he suspected this might be connected to larger criminal enterprises he'd encountered in his work. "Emma, what you're describing sounds like it could be part of a romance fraud operation," David said, his voice serious over our video call. "These aren't just random catfish looking for attention. These are organized criminal networks that specifically target successful women for financial exploitation. You need to consider reporting this to law enforcement." The suggestion that I should involve police hadn't occurred to me, but David's expertise made it impossible to ignore. If Jake was part of a larger criminal network, other women might be in immediate danger of financial exploitation. My investigation might have uncovered something much bigger than just personal betrayal. "I want to help you document everything properly," David continued. "But Emma, you need to be careful about how much further you investigate on your own. If this person realizes you've discovered their deception, they might disappear before law enforcement can identify them. Or worse, they might escalate in ways that could put you in danger." The warning about potential danger hadn't seriously occurred to me before, but David's concern forced me to confront the reality that I knew nothing about who I was actually dealing with. The person behind Jake's identity had demonstrated a willingness to maintain elaborate deceptions for years. There was no way to predict how they might react if they discovered their carefully constructed lies had been exposed. As I prepared for bed Wednesday night, I found myself staring at the printed photos of Jake that still covered my apartment wall. His handsome face smiled back at me from dozens of supposedly candid moments, hiking trips, cooking adventures, romantic selfies that had made me believe in our connection. Every image was now revealed as stolen from someone else's life, repurposed to create false intimacy with a person who didn't exist. Taking down those photos felt like dismantling a shrine to my own naivety, but I forced myself to leave them up, maintaining the appearance of a devoted girlfriend's apartment in case Jake ever asked for video calls that might reveal my living space. I was learning to think like the deceiver who'd been manipulating me, anticipating what details might give away my newfound knowledge of his lies. My last text exchange with Jake that night was perhaps the most difficult yet. He sent me a romantic goodnight message with a photo of stars supposedly visible from his Montana campsite. The image was breathtaking, professionally composed, and according to my reverse search, stolen from an astronomy photographer's portfolio, published 6 months earlier. "Falling asleep under these incredible stars," his message read, wishing you were here to share this view with me. Soon we'll be camping together under skies like this, just the two of us and the whole universe. Dream of adventures, beautiful. I love you more than there are stars in this sky. My response required summoning every acting skill I possessed. Your photos always make me feel like I'm there with you, I typed, each word a small betrayal of my own healing process. Can't wait for our first camping trip together. Sweet dreams, my love. I'll be dreaming of Montana stars and the amazing man who's photographing them. Sending that message felt like poison, but it was necessary poison. I was no longer the trusting woman who'd fallen asleep to Jake's romantic texts for 2 years. I was someone else entirely, someone determined to uncover the truth and protect other women from experiencing the devastation I was living through. Thursday would bring new challenges as I continued performing the role of the devoted girlfriend while conducting an investigation that was revealing increasingly disturbing evidence about the scope of Jake's deception. But for the first time since discovering his lies, I felt a sense of purpose beyond just personal healing. I was going to expose whoever was behind this elaborate fraud, and I was going to make sure he never had the opportunity to destroy another woman's ability to trust and love. The woman who went to sleep that Wednesday night was no longer a victim. She was an investigator, an actress, and a force that Jake Williams, whoever he really was, had no idea was coming for him. Thursday morning brought the breakthrough I'd been desperately seeking, though it came from an unexpected source. My brother David had spent the night running Jake's stolen photos through facial recognition databases used by law enforcement, and what he discovered would finally put a real name and face to the person who'd been manipulating me for 2 years. Emma, I need you to sit down for this, David said when he called at 7 a.m., his voice carrying the weight of significant news. I found him. I found the real person behind Jake Williams, and it's worse than we thought. The man who'd been posing as Jake Williams was actually Marcus Chen, a 34-year-old IT specialist living in Denver, Colorado. David had discovered that Marcus had an extensive criminal history involving identity theft, online fraud, and what law enforcement classified as romance scamming operation. He wasn't just some lonely individual using fake photos to get attention online. He was a career criminal who specialized in targeting successful women for elaborate long-term deception. Marcus Chen has been doing this for at least 6 years, David explained, sharing his screen to show me police reports and court documents. He's been arrested twice for similar schemes, but the charges were reduced both times because his victims didn't want to go through the trauma of testifying in court. The pattern is always the same. He creates multiple fake identities, targets financially independent women, and maintains relationships for years while gathering personal information that could be used for identity theft or financial fraud. Seeing Marcus Chen's real face was jarring in ways I hadn't expected. He looked nothing like the handsome model whose stolen photos had formed the basis of Jake Williams. Marcus was average height, slightly overweight, with thinning brown hair and unremarkable features that would blend into any crowd, but his eyes held an intelligence that was unsettling, the calculating gaze of someone who viewed other people as opportunities rather than human beings. The police reports revealed that Marcus's operation was even more sophisticated than Sophia and I had discovered through our amateur investigation. He maintained safe houses in multiple cities where he could create authentic-looking backdrops for his video call. He employed accomplices who helped create fake social media profiles and websites supporting his various identities. Most disturbing, he had access to databases of personal information that allowed him to research his targets extensively before making initial contact. Emma, there's something else, David continued, his voice becoming more serious. According to the FBI files I accessed, Marcus Chen is currently under surveillance as part of a larger investigation into organized romance fraud. You're not just a victim of his crimes, you're potentially a key witness in a federal case that could shut down an entire criminal network. The revelation that my personal nightmare was connected to a federal investigation was overwhelming. My private discovery of Jake's deception had accidentally intersected with law enforcement efforts to prosecute organized criminals who'd been destroying women's lives for years. The evidence I'd been gathering could help convict not just Marcus Chen, but potentially dozens of other criminals operating similar schemes. Within hours of David's discovery, my apartment became an unofficial command center for what would become one of the most significant romance fraud prosecutions in Texas history. Detective Lisa Parker from the Austin Police Department's Cybercrime Unit arrived that afternoon, followed by FBI agents specializing in online fraud and identity theft. What I'd thought would be a private conversation about my personal situation became a comprehensive briefing about a criminal enterprise that spanned multiple states and had victimized hundreds of women. Rodriguez, your case represents something we've been trying to build for 3 years, Detective Parker explained as she set up recording equipment in my living room. Marcus Chen has been incredibly careful about covering his tracks, but your documentation of his deception over 2 years provides the kind of detailed evidence we need to prove the systematic nature of his crime. The irony wasn't lost on me that my obsessive documentation of my relationship with Jake, the photos I'd saved, the messages I'd archived, the social media posts I'd screenshot, had created a perfect record of Marcus Chen's criminal methodology. Every romantic gesture I'd treasured had been evidence of fraud. Every loving conversation I'd saved had been documentation of systematic deception. Agent Sarah Williams from the FBI's Cyber Division explained that Marcus Chen was part of what they called a romance fraud syndicate, an organized network of criminals who shared resources, techniques, and even victim information to maximize their profits from elaborate deception. The Jake Williams identity was just one of dozens that Marcus maintained simultaneously, each designed to appeal to different demographics of successful women. We estimate that Marcus Chen alone has targeted over 200 women in the past 6 years, Agent Williams said, showing me a map with pins marking victims across the western United States. The financial losses total nearly $2 million, but the psychological damage is impossible to calculate. Women have lost their savings, their homes, their ability to trust future relationships. Some have attempted suicide after discovering the extent of their victimization. Learning that I was one of 200 women who'd fallen for Marcus Chen's deceptions was somehow both devastating and comforting. Devastating because it confirmed how thoroughly I'd been manipulated, but comforting because it proved that my inability to detect his lies wasn't a personal failing. It was evidence of how sophisticated his criminal operation had become. The FBI agents explained that Marcus Chen's network operated like a business, with different criminals specializing in various aspects of the fraud. Some created fake identities and social media profiles, others maintained the elaborate websites and documentation supporting those identities. Still others specialized in the psychological manipulation required to maintain long-term emotional relationships with victims. Marcus Chen was apparently one of their most skilled relationship managers, capable of maintaining intimate connections with multiple women simultaneously, while gathering information that could be used for further exploitation. The reason we've had difficulty prosecuting these cases is that the emotional manipulation is so sophisticated that victims often blame themselves rather than recognizing they've been targeted by professional criminals, Detective Parker explained. Your willingness to cooperate with our investigation could help other women understand that they weren't foolish or naive. They were victimized by experts who've perfected these techniques over years of practice. The investigation revealed that Marcus Chen had been far more dangerous than I'd realized. While he'd never directly asked me for money, he'd been systematically gathering information that could have been used for identity theft or financial fraud. He knew my social security number, my bank account information, my mother's maiden name, and dozens of other details that could have been used to steal my identity or access my account. More chilling was the discovery that Marcus Chen had been photographing and cataloging personal details about my life that he'd observed during our video calls. FBI analysis of his seized computers revealed hundreds of images he'd secretly captured during our conversations, screenshots of my apartment, close-ups of personal documents that had been visible in the background, and even photos of my mail that he'd been able to read when I'd carelessly left it within view of my laptop camera. He was essentially conducting surveillance on you through your own devices, Agent Williams explained. This information was being stored in databases that could be sold to other criminals or used for future identity theft. You weren't just being emotionally manipulated, you were being systematically documented for potential financial exploitation. The technical sophistication of Marcus Chen's operation was staggering. Law enforcement had discovered custom software he'd developed to manage multiple fake identities simultaneously, allowing him to schedule messages, maintain consistent backstories, and avoid the kind of contradictions that might expose his deception. He'd created algorithms that analyzed his victims' social media posts to determine optimal timing for romantic gestures and emotional manipulation. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Marcus Chen had been sharing information about his victims with other criminals in his network. Details about my personality, my vulnerabilities, my financial situation, and my family background had been compiled into profiles that could be used to target me for future scams or sold to other criminals looking for victims who matched my demographic profile. The FBI's investigation had also uncovered evidence that Marcus Chen's network was preparing to escalate their operation. They'd been developing more sophisticated identity theft schemes, investment fraud opportunities, and even elaborate fake emergency scenarios designed to extract large sums of money from their long-term victims. I had apparently been selected as a candidate for what they called a major extraction, a final elaborate deception that would have cost me tens of thousands of dollars before Marcus disappeared forever. Based on our analysis of his communications with other network members, Marcus Chen was planning to propose to you within the next 6 months, Detective Parker revealed. The engagement would have been followed by a series of manufactured emergencies, medical bills, family crises, business opportunities, that would have gradually drained your savings before he vanished with a new identity. Learning how close I'd come to even more devastating financial losses made me grateful for Sophia's late-night reverse image search, but it also filled me with urgency about helping other women who might still be targeted. The FBI explained that Marcus Chen's arrest would need to be coordinated carefully to avoid alerting other network members who might destroy evidence or disappear with their current victims' money. "We want you to help us conduct what we call a controlled revelation," Agent Williams explained. "You would continue your relationship with Marcus Chen for a few more days, while we position ourselves to arrest him and his associates simultaneously. Your cooperation could help us save other women who are currently being targeted and gather evidence that could shut down this entire criminal network." The idea of continuing to perform the role of Jake's loving girlfriend while knowing his true identity was Marcus Chen felt impossible, but the opportunity to help other women and ensure justice made the sacrifice worthwhile. I agreed to wear recording equipment during my final interactions with Marcus, documenting his continued deceptions, even after law enforcement had identified him as a criminal. The controlled revelation was scheduled for the following Monday, giving law enforcement time to coordinate arrests across multiple states. During those final days, I maintained my performance as the trusting girlfriend while FBI agents monitored every communication between Marcus and me. His messages continued to be filled with romantic promises and detailed lies about his Montana assignment, completely unaware that each word was being recorded as evidence for his prosecution. Marcus Chen's arrest on Monday morning was swift and thorough. FBI agents raided his Denver apartment while he was sending me a good morning text message, seizing computers, phones, and filing cabinets filled with evidence of his criminal network. The timing was coordinated with simultaneous arrests of his associates across 4 states, ensuring that the entire operation was dismantled before anyone could destroy evidence or alert other victims. The moment I received confirmation of Marcus Chen's arrest was both triumphant and melancholic. Justice was finally being served for the man who'd stolen 2 years of my life, but it also meant confronting the finality of losing what I'd believed was the love of my life. Even knowing that Jake Williams had never existed, part of me mourned the loss of the relationship that had meant everything to me. The evidence seized from Marcus Chen's operation revealed the staggering scope of his crimes. Law enforcement discovered detailed files on over 300 women, with 47 currently being targeted by active deceptions. The financial losses exceeded $2 million, but the psychological damage was impossible to quantify. Women had made major life decisions based on relationships with men who didn't exist, turning down real opportunities and real relationships while investing their hearts in elaborate lies. My testimony during Marcus Chen's trial became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Standing in that federal courtroom, describing how systematically I'd been deceived, felt like reclaiming power that had been stolen from me through 2 years of manipulation. Every detail I shared about his deception helped other victims understand that they hadn't been foolish. They'd been targeted by a master criminal who'd perfected the art of emotional manipulation. Marcus Chen was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for charges including identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit organized fraud. His conviction led to the prosecution of 23 other criminals in his network and the recovery of over $1.8 million for victims. But more importantly, it exposed the systematic nature of romance fraud and led to new law enforcement protocols for investigating and prosecuting these crimes. The months following Marcus Chen's conviction were devoted to rebuilding my ability to trust and love authentically. I worked with therapists who specialized in helping victims of long-term deception, learning to separate my genuine capacity for love from the vulnerability that had made me a target. The process was difficult, but it was also liberating. I was rediscovering who I was when I wasn't performing the role of someone else's ideal girlfriend. Today, I work as a consultant, helping law enforcement agencies understand the psychological tactics used by romance fraud criminals. My experience with Marcus Chen's deception has become a resource for training investigators and educating potential victims about the warning signs of sophisticated online fraud. What began as the most devastating betrayal of my life has transformed into a mission to protect other women from experiencing similar manipulation. The woman who discovered those fake photos is not the same woman telling this story today. I've learned that trust can be rebuilt stronger than before when it's based on genuine knowledge rather than naive hope. I've discovered that love doesn't require blind faith. It thrives when it's grounded in honesty, transparency, and mutual respect for each other's autonomy. Jake Williams may have been a fiction, but the strength I found in exposing Marcus Chen's crimes was entirely real. The investigation that began with Sophia's reverse image search evolved into a federal case that protected hundreds of women from future victimization. My heartbreak became other women's salvation, and my determination to uncover the truth became a force that shut down an entire criminal network. Romance fraud continues to be a growing problem as criminals develop increasingly sophisticated techniques for online deception. But victims like me are fighting back, using our painful experiences to create resources and support systems that can help others recognize and escape similar situations. We're proving that even the most elaborate deceptions can be exposed when victims refuse to remain silent and isolate. The love I thought I'd lost when Jake Williams was revealed to be a lie has been replaced by something more valuable: authentic connections with people who value honesty, a career devoted to protecting others, and a sense of purpose that no criminal can steal. Marcus Chen took 2 years of my life, but he inadvertently gave me a mission that has brought more meaning and satisfaction than any fake relationship ever could. If you're reading this story and recognizing warning signs in your own online relationships, trust your instincts and seek help. The shame and embarrassment that romance fraud victims feel is exactly what criminals count on to keep their schemes hidden. But there is no shame in being targeted by professional criminals who've spent years perfecting their deception technique. The shame belongs entirely to those who choose to build their lives on the systematic destruction of other people's ability to trust and love. The courtroom was packed with victims when Marcus Chen's sentencing hearing began on a crisp October morning in Austin. I sat in the front row, no longer the naive woman who'd fallen for an elaborate digital deception, but someone who'd transformed personal devastation into a powerful force for justice and healing. The past 8 months since his arrest had been a journey of discovery, not just about his crimes, but about my own strength and capacity for helping others navigate similar betrayals. Standing at the victim impact podium, I looked directly at Marcus Chen as I prepared to speak. The man who'd masqueraded as Jake Williams for 2 years looked smaller than I'd expected, his features unremarkable compared to the digitally enhanced face he'd used to seduce me and dozens of other women. But his eyes still held that calculating intelligence that had enabled him to manipulate so many lives with such devastating precision. "Your Honor, Marcus Chen didn't just steal money from his victims," I began, my voice steady despite the weight of what I was about to share. "He stole our ability to trust, our confidence in our own judgment, and years of our lives that we invested in relationships we believed were building toward genuine futures. But what he failed to understand is that targeting strong, successful women would eventually lead to his downfall. I described the systematic nature of his deception, the sophisticated technology he'd used to maintain his lies, and the psychological manipulation that had kept me and his other victims trapped in relationships with a person who didn't exist. But I also spoke about the unexpected strength I'd discovered through the investigation, the friendships I'd formed with other victims, and the sense of purpose that had emerged from one of the darkest periods of my life. Marcus Chen thought he was creating victims, I continued, feeling the power of my transformation with each word. Instead, he created an army of women who are now dedicated to ensuring that no one else experiences what we've endured. His crimes against us have become our weapon against him and others like him. After my testimony, I listened as 12 other women shared their stories of being deceived by Marcus Chen's various fake identities. Each account revealed different aspects of his criminal methodology, but all shared common elements: the careful research he'd conducted on his targets, the gradual building of trust and intimacy, and the systematic gathering of personal information that could be used for identity theft or financial fraud. Rachel Kim, a veterinarian from Seattle, described how Marcus had posed as a wildlife photographer named David Morgan, using her love of animals to create an emotional connection that lasted 18 months. Jessica Taylor, a marketing executive from Phoenix, had been targeted by Marcus's persona as a travel writer named Alex Rodriguez, who'd convinced her to plan expensive vacations they'd never actually taken together. The pattern was clear. Marcus Chen had studied successful women in various professional fields, creating fake identities specifically designed to appeal to their interests, values, and vulnerability. He'd been a predator who'd specialized in targeting strength rather than weakness, understanding that successful women often had the financial resources and emotional capacity to sustain long-term relationships that could be exploited over time. Judge Patricia Morrison listened intently as victim after victim described the impact of Marcus Chen's crimes. The financial losses were significant, nearly $4 million when all victims were accounted for, but the psychological damage was what made these cases particularly heinous. Women had made major life decisions based on relationships with fictional characters, turning down real opportunities and real relationships, while investing their hearts in elaborate lies. Miss Chen, you have systematically destroyed the ability of dozens of women to trust and love authentically, Judge Morrison said as she prepared to announce his sentence. Your crimes represent a particularly cruel form of psychological abuse that has caused lasting damage to victims who deserved honesty and respect, not manipulation and exploitation. Marcus Chen received 23 years in federal prison, with requirements for full restitution to all identified victims and lifetime prohibition from accessing dating websites or social media platforms. His conviction had led to the prosecution of his entire criminal network, resulting in sentences totaling over 180 years for the various conspirators who'd helped maintain his elaborate deception. But the real victory wasn't just in seeing Marcus Chen's sentence, it was in what his victims had built together during the investigation and trial process. We'd created a support network that had evolved into a comprehensive resource for helping other women recognize and escape similar situations. The Austin Alliance for Digital Safety had become a model for victim advocacy that was being replicated across the country. My role in the organization had grown from personal healing to professional mission. I'd left my graphic design career to work full-time as a consultant, helping law enforcement agencies understand the psychological tactics used by romance fraud criminals. The skills I'd developed during my own investigation, digital forensics, victim outreach, and public speaking, had become tools for protecting other women from experiencing similar betrayals. The months following Marcus Chen's sentencing were devoted to expanding our advocacy work beyond just romance fraud. We'd discovered that the psychological manipulation techniques used by criminals like Marcus Chen were also employed in various other scams targeting successful women, fake investment opportunities, fraudulent business partnerships, and elaborate charity schemes that exploited women's desire to make a positive impact on the world. Working with Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specialized in helping victims of long-term deception, I'd developed educational programs that taught women to recognize the warning signs of sophisticated manipulation before they became emotionally invested in fraudulent relationships. The programs weren't just about protecting potential victims, they were about empowering women to trust their instincts and maintain their independence, even in genuine relationships. The most important lesson from cases like Marcus Chen's is that healthy relationships enhance your life rather than requiring you to diminish it, Dr. Foster explained during one of our workshops. Real love doesn't ask you to ignore red flags, make excuses for inconsistencies, or sacrifice your autonomy for someone else's convenience. The workshops had attracted hundreds of women from across Texas and beyond, many of whom had experienced various forms of romantic deception or manipulation. What struck me most about these gatherings was how many women had stories similar to mine, intelligent, successful individuals who'd been targeted specifically because of their strength and resources, not despite them. Through these workshops, I'd met women who'd been deceived by fake military personnel, fraudulent doctors, fictitious entrepreneurs, and elaborate widower personas designed to exploit their compassion. The common thread wasn't naivety or desperation, it was the targeting of women who had the emotional and financial capacity to sustain long-term relationships that could be exploited over time. My own healing journey had been complicated by the public nature of Marcus Chen's case. Media coverage of his trial had made me a recognizable figure in discussions about online fraud, leading to speaking engagements, interviews, and consulting opportunities that kept me connected to the trauma even as I worked to help others avoid similar experience. But visibility had also brought unexpected connections. I'd been contacted by women around the world who'd experienced similar deceptions, many of whom had remained silent due to shame or embarrassment about being deceived. My willingness to speak publicly about my experience had given them permission to seek help and support, creating a global network of survivors who were working to expose and prevent romance fraud. The international scope of the problem had become clear through these connections. Romance fraud was a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry that operated across borders, with organized networks sharing victim information, successful deception techniques, and technological tools for maintaining elaborate lies. The Marcus Chen case had been just one small piece of a much larger criminal enterprise that was systematically targeting women worldwide. My work had evolved to include collaboration with international law enforcement agencies, sharing intelligence about criminal networks, and helping develop prosecution strategies that could address the global nature of these crimes. The expertise I'd gained through my own victimization had become a resource for investigators and prosecutors who were working to shut down similar operations in other countries. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my transformation had been the personal relationships I'd built with other survivors. The women I'd met through the Marcus Chen investigation had become some of my closest friends, united by shared experiences of betrayal and recovery that had created bonds deeper than ordinary friendship. Rachel Kim from Seattle had become my closest collaborator in developing educational materials about romance fraud. Her background in veterinary medicine had given her a unique perspective on predatory behavior that helped us understand how criminals like Marcus Chen selected and groomed their victims. Together, we'd created resources that were being used by law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. Jessica Taylor from Phoenix had used her marketing expertise to develop social media campaigns that raised awareness about romance fraud while avoiding the victim blaming that often characterized public discussions of these crimes. Her work had reached millions of people, helping potential victims recognize warning signs before they became emotionally invested in fraudulent relationships. The friendship and professional partnerships I'd formed with other survivors had replaced the isolation I'd felt during my relationship with the fictional Jake Williams. Instead of organizing my life around one person's schedule and needs, I'd built a network of genuine relationships, based on mutual support, shared purposes, and authentic connection. My romantic life had remained deliberately simple during the first year after Marcus Chen's arrest. The process of rebuilding trust in my own judgment had required stepping away from dating entirely, focusing instead on rediscovering who I was when I wasn't performing the role of someone else's ideal girlfriend. The woman who'd emerged from that process was stronger, more independent, and more selective about who she allowed into her life. When I eventually did begin dating again, it was with an entirely different approach. I insisted on meeting potential partners in person within the first week of online contact. I verified their identities through multiple sources before allowing emotional investment. I maintained my friendships, my career, and my independence, regardless of how promising a new relationship might seem. The man I eventually began seeing seriously was someone I'd met through my advocacy work, a cybersecurity specialist named Tom Rodriguez, who'd been consulting on romance fraud cases. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared professional interests and mutual respect for each other's independence. There were no grand romantic gestures or elaborate promises about exotic futures together. Instead, there was honesty, consistency, and the kind of genuine compatibility that didn't require performance or pretense. Tom had been patient with my hyper-vigilance about online security and my need to verify details that most people would take for granted. He understood that my caution wasn't paranoia, it was the wisdom gained through surviving systematic deception by a professional criminal. He'd helped me develop personal security protocols that allowed me to maintain online presence for my advocacy work, while protecting myself from potential targeting by other criminals. The anniversary of discovering Marcus Chen's deception had become a day of reflection and celebration rather than mourning. October 15th marked not just the end of my relationship with a fictional character, but the beginning of my transformation into someone who could help other women avoid similar betrayals. It was the day I'd stopped being a victim and started becoming an advocate. My apartment in Austin had been completely transformed from the shrine to Jake Williams it had once been. The walls that had once displayed stolen photos of a handsome stranger now featured artwork created by survivors of various forms of fraud and abuse. My home had become a space that reflected my authentic interests and values, rather than my desire to please someone who didn't exist. The Austin Alliance for Digital Safety had grown into a nationally recognized organization that provided resources, education, and support for victims of online fraud. We'd helped over 200 women escape fraudulent relationships, assisted law enforcement with dozens of prosecutions, and developed educational materials that were being used by schools, businesses, and community organizations across the country. But the work that brought me the most satisfaction was one-on-one counseling with women who'd recently discovered they'd been deceived by online criminals. I remembered the devastating isolation of that first night, after Sophia's screenshot had shattered my reality, and I was determined that no other woman would have to navigate that darkness alone. Each conversation with a new victim reminded me of how far I'd traveled from that naive woman who'd believed every word of Jake Williams' elaborate lie. The strength I'd found through investigating Marcus Chen's crimes had become a permanent part of my identity, a foundation that no future deception could shake. The love I'd thought I'd lost when Jake Williams was revealed to be a fiction had been replaced by something far more valuable: authentic connections with people who valued honesty, a career devoted to protecting others, and a sense of purpose that grew stronger with each woman I helped escape similar situations. Marcus Chen had intended to destroy my ability to trust and love, but he'd inadvertently created the opposite result. Through the process of exposing his crimes and helping other women heal from similar betrayals, I'd developed a deeper capacity for authentic connection than I'd ever possessed before. The relationships in my life were now based on genuine compatibility, rather than manipulation, real shared values, rather than performed preferences. The woman who'd discovered those fake photos 2 years ago had believed that love required blind trust and constant accommodation. The woman telling this story today understood that real love thrived on honesty, independence, and mutual respect for each other's autonomy. Marcus Chen had stolen 2 years of my life, but he'd inadvertently given me a mission that brought more meaning and satisfaction than any fake relationship ever could. If you're reading this story and recognizing warning signs in your own online relationships, please know that you're not alone, and you're not foolish. The shame and embarrassment that romance fraud victims feel is exactly what criminals count on to keep their schemes hidden. But there is no shame in being targeted by professional criminals who've spent years perfecting their deception techniques. The shame belongs entirely to those who choose to build their lives on the systematic destruction of other people's ability to trust and love. The Austin Alliance for Digital Safety continues to grow, helping women across the country recognize and escape fraudulent relationships, while working with law enforcement to prosecute the criminals who perpetrate these crimes. What began as my personal nightmare has become a force for justice and healing that prevents other women from experiencing similar betrayals. Romance fraud will continue to evolve as criminals develop new technologies and techniques for online deception. But victims like me are fighting back, using our painful experiences to create resources and support systems that can help others recognize and escape similar situations. We're proving that even the most elaborate deceptions can be exposed when victims refuse to remain silent and isolate. The love story that began with stolen photos and elaborate lies has transformed into something far more powerful, a community of survivors who've turned their pain into purpose, their betrayal into strength, and their individual healing into collective protection for other women. Marcus Chen destroyed the relationship he'd created, but he couldn't destroy the woman who'd survived it. 3 years after that life-changing screenshot from Sophia, I stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Texas, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the first International Conference on Digital Deception and Victim Recovery. The woman who'd once planned her entire life around video calls with a fictional photographer had become a recognized expert in romance fraud prevention, but more importantly, I'd become living proof that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. The conference had attracted cybersecurity experts, law enforcement officers, mental health professionals, and survivors from around the world. What had started as my personal mission to help other women avoid similar betrayals had evolved into a global movement that was changing how society understood and responded to sophisticated online fraud. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice carrying across the silent auditorium. I want to tell you about a woman who thought she'd found the love of her life through a dating app. For 2 years, she planned her future around a man who sent her romantic messages from exotic locations, who remembered every detail of her dreams, and who promised her adventures that would last a lifetime. That woman was me, and that man never existed. The audience was completely silent as I shared the story that had transformed my life, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a survivor who'd turned devastating betrayal into a force for positive change. I described the sophisticated nature of Marcus Chen's deception, the psychological manipulation that had kept me trapped in a fictional relationship, and the strength I'd discovered through the process of exposing his crimes. But this wasn't just about my story anymore. The conference represented something much larger, a comprehensive approach to addressing romance fraud that combined victim support, law enforcement training, public education, and technological solutions. The Austin Alliance for Digital Safety had become the prototype for similar organizations worldwide, creating a network of support that spanned continents and cultures. Elena Vasquez, a criminologist from Barcelona who'd been studying romance fraud patterns across Europe, presented research showing that the techniques used by criminals like Marcus Chen were being replicated by organized networks on every continent. Her data revealed that romance fraud had become a multi-billion-dollar global industry that specifically targeted educated, financially independent women who were seeking genuine connection. The stereotype of romance fraud victims as lonely, desperate women is not just wrong, it's dangerous, Dr. Vasquez explained. Criminals like Marcus Chen deliberately target successful women because they have the emotional and financial resources to sustain long-term relationships that can be exploited over time. We need to stop victim blaming and start recognizing that these are sophisticated crimes against people who deserve our support, not our judgment. The research presented at the conference confirmed what I'd learned through my own experience and advocacy work. Romance fraud criminals were professional predators who studied their victims extensively, using psychological manipulation techniques that were designed to exploit strength rather than weakness. They targeted women who were successful, independent, and emotionally available, qualities that should have been assets, not vulnerabilities. Agent Michael Torres from the FBI's Cybercrime Division presented updates on the ongoing investigation into Marcus Chen's criminal network. His arrest had led to the prosecution of 63 other criminals across 12 countries, resulting in sentences totaling over 400 years, and the recovery of nearly $15 million for victims. But more importantly, the investigation had revealed the international scope of organized romance fraud, and led to new protocols for cross-border law enforcement cooperation. The Marcus Chen case changed how we approach romance fraud investigations, Agent Torres explained. Emma Rodriguez's documentation of his deception over 2 years provided the kind of detailed evidence we needed to prove the systematic nature of these crimes. Her courage in cooperating with our investigation, while maintaining her relationship with her catfish, gave us insights into criminal methodology that we'd never been able to obtain before. The conference workshops focused on practical solutions for preventing and responding to romance fraud. I led a session on red flags and recovery that taught attendees to recognize the warning signs of sophisticated deception while building resilience against future manipulation. The room was packed with women who'd experienced various forms of online fraud, many of whom had remained silent about their experiences until finding the courage to seek help. One workshop participant, Maria Santos from Miami, shared her story of being deceived by a fake military officer who'd used her patriotism and desire to support troops overseas to extract nearly $80,000 over 18 months. Another woman, Dr. Jennifer Park from Vancouver, described how she'd been targeted by a fraudulent medical researcher who'd exploited her professional interests to build a relationship that lasted 3 years before she discovered his true identity. The stories were heartbreakingly similar despite their different details. Each woman had been carefully selected and researched by criminals who understood exactly how to appeal to their specific interests, values, and vulnerabilities. The deceptions had been sophisticated enough to fool intelligent, successful women who were naturally cautious about online relationships. But what struck me most about these workshops was how quickly shame and isolation transformed into strength and solidarity when women realized they weren't alone in their experiences. The same pattern I'd witnessed in my own recovery, the progression from victim to survivor to advocate, was happening in real time as women connected with others who understood their experiences without judgment. The technological advances presented at the conference offered hope for preventing future romance fraud. Artificial intelligence systems were being developed to detect fake profiles and stolen photos across multiple platforms simultaneously. Blockchain technology was being explored as a way to create verifiable digital identities that would make it harder for criminals to maintain elaborate fictional personas. But the most promising developments were in education and early intervention. The Austin Alliance for Digital Safety had partnered with dating platforms to create voluntary verification systems that helped users confirm their matches' identities before emotional investment occurred. We'd also developed educational materials that were being integrated into high school and college curricula, teaching young people to recognize manipulation techniques before they became victims. My personal life had continued to evolve alongside my professional mission. Tom Rodriguez and I had been married for 18 months in a ceremony that celebrated authenticity rather than fantasy. Our relationship was built on the foundation of honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to helping other crime victims. Unlike my fictional relationship with Jake Williams, our marriage enhanced our individual identities rather than requiring us to perform roles for each other's approval. Tom had become my partner in both life and work, using his cybersecurity expertise to help develop better detection systems for romance fraud, while supporting my advocacy effort. Together, we'd created a model for how genuine relationships could thrive when built on trust rather than deception, independence rather than dependence. The work that had emerged from my personal nightmare had taken on a life of its own. The Austin Alliance for Digital Safety had helped over 500 women escape fraudulent relationships, assisted law enforcement with more than 100 prosecutions, and developed educational materials that were being used by organizations worldwide. But the numbers didn't capture the most important impact: the prevention of future victimization through education and awareness. Every woman who recognized warning signs because of our educational programs represented a victory that extended beyond individual protection. Each person who learned to trust their instincts rather than ignore red flags contributed to a cultural shift that made it harder for criminals to operate successfully. The shame and silence that had historically surrounded romance fraud was being replaced by openness and support that empowered victims to seek help. The conference concluded with the announcement of a new international task force dedicated to combating romance fraud. The task force would coordinate law enforcement efforts across borders, share intelligence about criminal networks, and develop standardized protocols for supporting victims. I had been invited to serve as the civilian advisor, representing the perspective of survivors who'd transformed their experiences into advocacy. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the conference came during a private meeting with 12 women who'd traveled from around the world to attend. Each had been victimized by romance fraud, and each had chosen to transform their experiences into advocacy work in their home country. Together, we were creating a global network of survivors who were working to ensure that no other woman would have to navigate the devastation of discovering that the love of her life was a carefully constructed lie. "Emma, what you've built here gives me hope that my experience can help other women too," said Catherine Thompson from London, who'd been deceived by a fake businessman for over 3 years. "I've been ashamed and isolated since discovering the truth, but seeing what you've accomplished makes me realize that my pain can become someone else's protection." The transformation from victim to advocate wasn't just about helping others, it was about reclaiming power that had been stolen through systematic deception. Every woman who chose to speak publicly about her experience was taking back control from the criminals who'd counted on silence and shame to protect their operations. As I returned to Austin after the conference, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who'd discovered those fake photos in Sophia's screenshot had believed that love required blind trust and constant accommodation. The woman returning from an international conference on digital deception understood that real love thrived on honesty, independence, and mutual respect for each other's autonomy. Marcus Chen had intended to destroy my ability to trust and love, but he'd inadvertently created the opposite result. Through the process of exposing his crimes and helping other women heal from similar betrayals, I developed a deeper capacity for authentic connection than I'd ever possessed before. The relationships in my life were now based on genuine compatibility rather than manipulation, real shared values rather than performed preferences. The Austin Alliance for Digital Safety continued to grow, expanding its mission beyond romance fraud to address various forms of online deception that targeted women. We developed programs for recognizing fake investment opportunities, fraudulent business partnerships, and elaborate charity schemes that exploited women's desire to make a positive impact on the world. My work had also evolved to include training law enforcement officers about the psychological impact of romance fraud on victims. Too many women had been dismissed or blamed by investigators who didn't understand the sophisticated nature of these crimes. The training programs I'd developed helped officers recognize that romance fraud victims weren't weak or foolish, they were survivors of professional-level psychological manipulation who deserved support and justice. The educational materials we'd created were being used by schools, businesses, and community organizations across the country. The goal wasn't just to prevent individual victimization, but to create a cultural shift that made it harder for criminals to operate successfully. Every person who learned to recognize manipulation techniques contributed to a society that was less vulnerable to deception. But the most rewarding aspect of my work remained the one-on-one counseling with women who'd recently discovered they'd been deceived by online criminals. I remembered the devastating isolation of that first night after Sophia's screenshot had shattered my reality, and I was determined that no other woman would have to navigate that darkness alone. Each conversation with a new victim reminded me of how far I'd traveled from that naive woman who'd believed every word of Jake Williams' elaborate lie. The strength I'd found through investigating Marcus Chen's crimes had become a permanent part of my identity, a foundation that no future deception could shake. The love story that had begun with stolen photos and elaborate lies had transformed into something far more powerful, a community of survivors who'd turned their pain into purpose, their betrayal into strength, and their individual healing into collective protection for other women. Marcus Chen had destroyed the relationship he'd created, but he couldn't destroy the woman who'd survived it. As I looked toward the future, I saw endless possibilities for expanding our impact. The International Task Force would coordinate efforts across borders, sharing intelligence and resources that could shut down criminal networks before they claimed new victims. The educational programs would reach more young people, teaching them to recognize manipulation before they became targets. Most importantly, the network of survivors who'd transformed their experiences into advocacy would continue to grow, creating a global force for justice and healing that prevented other women from experiencing similar betrayal. We were proving that even the most elaborate deceptions could be exposed when victims refused to remain silent and isolated. The woman who'd fallen in love with a fictional photographer had become someone who helped other women recognize the difference between authentic connection and professional manipulation. The relationship that had consumed 2 years of my life with lies had been replaced by a marriage built on truth, a career devoted to justice, and a sense of purpose that grew stronger with each woman I helped escape similar situations. Marcus Chen had thought he was creating a victim when he targeted me with his elaborate Jake Williams deception. Instead, he'd created an advocate who would spend the rest of her life ensuring that his methods could never again be used so successfully against other women. The phoenix that had risen from the ashes of his deception was stronger, wiser, and more determined than the woman he'd tried to destroy. The love I'd thought I'd lost when Jake Williams was revealed to be a fiction had been replaced by something far more valuable. Authentic connections with people who valued honesty, a career devoted to protecting others, and a sense of purpose that no criminal could steal. Romance fraud had changed my life, but not in the way Marcus Chen had intended. It had transformed me into someone who could help other women avoid similar betrayals while building a global movement for justice and healing. 5 years after that devastating screenshot changed everything, I found myself standing in the same Austin coffee shop where Sophia had first shown me the reverse image search results that exposed Jake Williams as a fraud. The daily grind had become something of a pilgrimage site for me, a place where I came to reflect on the journey that had transformed the most painful experience of my life into a mission that now protected thousands of women worldwide. The coffee shop looked exactly the same, but the woman sitting at the corner table was fundamentally different from the one who'd stared at those Getty Images watermarks with shaking hands. Emma Rodriguez, the naive graphic designer who'd planned her entire future around video calls with a fictional photographer, had evolved into Dr. Emma Rodriguez, a nationally recognized expert in online fraud prevention who'd just finished defending her doctoral dissertation on psychological manipulation in digital romance fraud. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia, who was now running her own digital security consulting firm, specializing in helping businesses protect their employees from various forms of online deception. Saw the news about the Netflix documentary. I'm so proud of how far you've come. Remember when we thought we were just helping one woman escape a catfish? The Netflix documentary Sophia was referring to had premiered the previous week, telling the story of how my personal nightmare had evolved into a global movement. Stolen Hearts, the Emma Rodriguez story had reached over 30 million viewers in its first week, sparking conversations about romance fraud that were happening in living rooms, classrooms, and corporate boardrooms around the world. But the documentary was just the latest milestone in a journey that had taken me far beyond anything I could have imagined when I first discovered Marcus Chen's deception. The Austin Alliance for Digital Safety had expanded into an international organization with chapters in 23 countries. Our educational programs were being used by schools, universities, and corporations worldwide. Most importantly, we'd helped over 2,000 women escape fraudulent relationships while assisting law enforcement with more than 300 prosecutions. The work had also led to unexpected personal revelations. Through my research into romance fraud patterns, I discovered that my own family history included a grandmother who'd been victimized by a similar scheme in the 90s. Rosa Rodriguez had fallen in love with a man who'd claimed to be a traveling businessman, only to discover after 2 years of correspondence that he was actually a convicted con artist who'd been targeting war widows across the Southwest. Learning about my grandmother's experience had provided a deeper understanding of how these crimes had evolved over generations. The basic psychology of manipulation remained the same, but technology had amplified the scale and sophistication of the deception. What had once required face-to-face meetings and handwritten letters could now be accomplished through dating apps, social media, and digital communication platforms that reached millions of potential victims simultaneously. The most gratifying aspect of my work had been witnessing the transformation of other survivors who'd chosen to turn their pain into purpose. Rachel Kim had become a leading researcher in predatory behavior patterns, publishing papers that were changing how law enforcement approached romance fraud investigation. Jessica Taylor had started a nonprofit organization that provided financial assistance to fraud victims who'd lost their savings to elaborate deceptions. But perhaps the most powerful example of this transformation was Maria Santos, the Miami woman who'd been deceived by a fake military officer. She'd channeled her experience into creating a verification system for military personnel that was now being used by dating platforms to prevent fake soldier profiles. Her work had prevented thousands of women from being targeted by criminals who exploited patriotism and support for troops to facilitate their deception. These women had become my closest friends and collaborators, united by experiences that had initially isolated us, but ultimately connected us in ways that transcended ordinary friendship. We'd created a sisterhood of survivors who understood each other's journey from victim to advocate, from shame to strength, from isolation to community. The international conference had become an annual event, attracting hundreds of participants from around the world who were working to combat various forms of online deception. This year's conference would focus on emerging threats, including artificial intelligence-powered chatbots that could maintain romantic conversations with multiple victims simultaneously, and deepfake technology that was making it even harder to verify the authenticity of video communication. My marriage to Tom had provided a foundation of stability and authenticity that anchored me throughout the intensity of my advocacy work. Our relationship had become a living example of how genuine connections could thrive when built on honesty rather than deception, independence rather than dependence. We'd weathered the challenges of my public role and the emotional demands of working with trauma victims, emerging stronger and more committed to each other and our shared mission. Tom had also become an integral part of the Austin Alliance, using his cybersecurity expertise to develop technological solutions that could detect and prevent romance fraud. His work on artificial intelligence systems that could identify fake profiles and stolen photos had been adopted by major dating platforms, making it significantly harder for criminals to create convincing fake identities. The ripple effects of our work had extended far beyond romance fraud prevention. The educational materials we'd developed were being adapted to address other forms of online deception, including fake investment schemes, fraudulent business opportunities, and elaborate charity scams that targeted people's desire to make a positive impact on the world. We'd also discovered that the psychological resilience skills we taught to help women recognize and resist manipulation had broader application. The same techniques that helped someone identify a romance scammer could also help them recognize manipulation in workplace relationships, family dynamics, and other personal situations where someone might be exploiting their trust or goodwill. The most unexpected development had been the emergence of a new generation of advocates who'd learned about romance fraud through our educational programs rather than through personal victimization. These young women understood the warning signs and psychological tactics used by criminals, making them nearly impossible to deceive. They were becoming educators, researchers, and advocates who could help prevent future crimes without having to experience the devastation of being victimized themselves. One of these young advocates, Sarah Chen, had recently started her own organization, focused on educating college students about online safety. Her work was reaching thousands of young people who were just beginning to navigate romantic relationships in the digital age, providing them with knowledge and skills that could protect them throughout their lives. Emma, what you've built has given my generation the tools to protect ourselves, Sarah had told me during a recent mentoring session. We don't have to learn about manipulation through painful experience, because you've documented the patterns and taught us to recognize them. You've prevented countless women from going through what you endured. The prevention aspect of our work had become increasingly important as we'd realized that the most effective way to combat romance fraud was to stop it before it started. Every woman who recognized warning signs because of our educational programs represented a victory that extended beyond individual protection to include the prevention of financial losses, emotional trauma, and the lasting damage to trust that characterized these crimes. My doctoral research had focused on the long-term psychological effects of romance fraud on victims, documenting how the experience of being systematically deceived by someone they loved affected their ability to form future relationships. The research had revealed that victims often experienced symptoms similar to those seen in survivors of other forms of psychological abuse, including difficulty trusting their own judgment, hypervigilance in relationships, and persistent feelings of shame and self-blame. But the research had also documented the remarkable resilience of survivors who'd received appropriate support and education. Women who understood that they'd been targeted by professional criminals rather than fooled by their own poor judgment were able to recover more quickly and completely. They were also more likely to form healthy relationships in the future, having learned to recognize the difference between authentic connection and manipulation. The shame and stigma that had historically surrounded romance fraud was gradually being replaced by understanding and support. Media coverage was becoming more sophisticated, focusing on the criminal nature of these schemes rather than victim-blaming narratives that questioned why intelligent women would fall for such deception. The shift in public perception was creating an environment where victims felt safer seeking help and support. Law enforcement agencies had also evolved in their approach to romance fraud cases. Officers were receiving training about the psychological impact of these crimes, learning to recognize that victims weren't weak or foolish, but rather survivors of sophisticated manipulation. Prosecution rates had increased significantly as investigators developed better techniques for gathering evidence and building cases against international criminal networks. The Marcus Chen case had become a model for how to successfully prosecute romance fraud, with the detailed documentation I'd provided during my 2-year relationships serving as a template for other investigations. The techniques we'd developed for gathering evidence while maintaining victims' safety had been adopted by law enforcement agencies worldwide, leading to more successful prosecutions and longer sentences for convicted criminals. But perhaps the most important change had been in how society understood and responded to romance fraud. The stereotype of victims as desperate, lonely women had been replaced by recognition that these crimes specifically targeted successful, independent women who had the resources and emotional capacity to sustain long-term relationships. The victim blaming that had once characterized public discussions of romance fraud was being replaced by calls for better education and support system. As I sat in that Austin coffee shop reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point, I felt profound gratitude for the woman who'd been brave enough to investigate those fake photos rather than simply confronting her catfish and walking away. That decision to document everything, to seek help from law enforcement, and to transform personal pain into public advocacy had created ripple effects that were still expanding 5 years later. The love story that had begun with stolen photos and elaborate lies had become something far more powerful than any romantic relationship could have been. It had become a movement that protected thousands of women, a network of survivors who'd turned their pain into purpose, and a legacy that would continue long after I was gone. Marcus Chen had thought he was creating a victim when he targeted me with his Jake Williams deception. Instead, he'd created an advocate who would spend the rest of her life ensuring that his methods could never again be used so successfully against other women. The phoenix that had risen from the ashes of his deception had become a force for justice and healing that extended far beyond what any individual relationship could have accomplished. The woman who'd fallen in love with a fictional photographer had become someone who helped other women recognize the difference between authentic connection and professional manipulation. The relationship that had consumed 2 years of my life with lies had been replaced by a marriage built on truth, a career devoted to justice, and a sense of purpose that grew stronger with each woman I helped escape similar situations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.